He thought she couldn't afford a single diamond, but within minutes, he would realize he had just misjudged the most powerful woman to walk through his doors that year. The glass doors of Bennett and Company. Jewelers slid open with a soft whisper, letting in a streak of late afternoon sunlight that spilled across polished marble floors, reflecting 1,000 fractured glimmers from the displays inside. Evelyn Carter stepped in quietly, her presence almost dissolving into the elegant stillness of the showroom. At 38, she carried herself with a calm, unhurried grace, dressed in a simple cream cardigan, dark jeans, and low heels that made barely a sound against the gleaming floor. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention, and yet there was something deliberate in the way her eyes moved, steady and observant, taking in every detail as if she weren't just visiting the store, but measuring it. Behind the central counter, Lucas Bennett adjusted his tailored suit jacket and glanced up, his practiced smile forming out of habit before it faltered ever so slightly. Years in luxury retail had trained him to assess clients in seconds, to distinguish serious buyers from casual browsers without a word being spoken. And as his gaze swept over Evelyn's understated outfit, that internal calculation had already been made. Not a client. Not today. Not for anything that mattered. The faint click of her heels echoed softly as Evelyn approached one of the diamond displays, her reflection briefly merging with the shimmering necklaces beneath the glass. She leaned in just enough to examine a piece, her expression thoughtful, her eyes catching the light in a way that suggested familiarity rather than curiosity. A young associate nearby hesitated, then leaned subtly toward another employee, whispering just low enough to seem discreet, though not low enough to go unheard in a room designed for quiet. "She's probably just looking," the associate murmured, a hint of amusement tucked behind professionalism. Evelyn didn't react. If she heard them, she gave no sign. Her fingers rested lightly against the glass, not tapping, not impatient, just present. Across the showroom, Lucas exhaled through his nose, smoothing his tie before stepping forward with controlled precision. The marble floor seemed to amplify each step he took, a rhythmic announcement of authority as he approached her. "Good afternoon," he said, his tone polished but edged with something faintly dismissive. "Can I help you find something more within reach?" The words hung in the air, carefully chosen, polite enough on the surface, but carrying an unmistakable implication beneath. Evelyn turned to face him slowly, her expression calm, almost unreadable. For a brief moment, the reflections of the diamonds danced across her eyes, making it impossible to tell whether she was amused, offended, or simply indifferent. "I'd like to see that piece," she said softly, gesturing toward a necklace displayed under focused lighting at the center of the case. Lucas followed her gesture, his lips tightening slightly as he recognized the item. It wasn't just expensive. It was one of their signature pieces, valued well into 7 figures, reserved for clients who had already proven themselves long before stepping inside. His smile returned, thinner now, more rehearsed than genuine. "That collection is typically reserved for private viewings," he replied smoothly, folding his hands in front of him. "We usually recommend starting with something more accessible." A subtle shift passed through the room. A couple browsing nearby glanced over, sensing the tension beneath the exchange. The associate who had whispered earlier straightened, suddenly very interested in rearranging a display that didn't need rearranging. Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. She looked at Lucas, not with challenge, not with irritation, but with a quiet steadiness that seemed to stretch the moment longer than it should have. The air felt different now, heavier, as if the room itself were waiting for something to happen. And somewhere beneath the polished surfaces and sparkling glass, a shift had already begun, one that Lucas Bennett could not yet see, but would soon be forced to face. Lucas Bennett held his posture, confident that the conversation had already reached its natural end, but Evelyn Carter did not move, did not step back, and did not redirect her attention to anything more accessible, as he had suggested. Instead, she let a quiet pause settle between them, the kind of silence that stretched just long enough to make the air feel slightly uncomfortable. Her eyes drifted back to the necklace, studying the way each diamond caught the light, the precision of the setting, the symmetry of its design, as if she were evaluating more than just its beauty. "I understand your policy," she said calmly, her voice even and unhurried. but I would still like to see that piece. Lucas felt a flicker of irritation beneath his polished exterior. He had encountered persistence before, but this was different. There was no pleading in her tone, no hesitation, no attempt to justify herself. It was simply a statement, delivered with quiet certainty. Around them, the showroom seemed to shift ever so slightly. A couple who had been admiring a bracelet now watched openly, their interest drawn not by the jewelry, but by the unfolding interaction. One of the associates froze mid-motion, holding a velvet tray a little too long in the air, uncertain whether to step in or stay out of it. Lucas forced a smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "As I mentioned," he said, his voice tightening just enough to reveal the strain beneath, "that collection is reserved for clients who have scheduled private appointments. It is part of maintaining the exclusivity of our brand." Evelyn nodded once, as if acknowledging his words, but there was something about the gesture that felt more like she was confirming a conclusion rather than accepting a limitation. "Exclusivity," she repeated softly, her gaze returning to him, steady and composed. "That is an interesting word." Lucas shifted his weight slightly, the faintest crack in his otherwise controlled stance. He was used to conversations that followed predictable patterns, where authority was either accepted or challenged openly. This was neither. This was something quieter, something that did not push against him directly, but did not yield either. "We pride ourselves on it," he replied, lifting his chin just a fraction. "Our clients expect a certain standard." For a brief moment, Evelyn's expression softened, not into a smile, but into something more reflective, as if she had heard that exact phrase many times before in many different places. "And what standard would that be?" she asked. The question was simple, but it landed with an unexpected weight. Lucas opened his mouth to respond, then paused, realizing that whatever answer he gave would reveal more than he intended. He recovered quickly, his tone returning to its rehearsed confidence. "A standard of refinement, discretion, and suitability." The last word lingered in the air, heavier than the others. Evelyn's gaze did not waver. If anything, it sharpened slightly, though her posture remained relaxed, her hands loosely clasped in front of her. "Suitability," she echoed again, almost thoughtfully, as if testing the word against her own understanding. The room had grown noticeably quieter now. Even the soft background music seemed distant, overshadowed by the tension that had settled between them. Somewhere near the entrance, a door opened and closed, but no one turned to look. All attention remained fixed on the quiet exchange at the center of the showroom. Lucas exhaled slowly, deciding to bring the conversation to a close on his terms. "Perhaps," he said, gesturing subtly toward a different display, "you might find something more appropriate over here. We have several beautiful pieces that would be a better fit." It was a final offer, wrapped in courtesy but edged with dismissal. Evelyn followed his gesture for a brief second, her eyes passing over the smaller, less prominent pieces he indicated, before returning to him. Then, without raising her voice, without changing her tone, she said, "No, thank you. I am interested in that one." The simplicity of her response seemed to settle into the room like a quiet challenge. Lucas felt it before he fully understood it, a subtle shift in control, as if the balance of the interaction had begun to tilt in a way he could not yet explain. He straightened his jacket again, a small, habitual gesture meant to restore his composure. "I am afraid that will not be possible today," he replied firmly. Evelyn held his gaze for a long moment, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them, something that neither of them acknowledged out loud. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Not in defeat, not in agreement, but as if she had reached a decision of her own. And as she turned her eyes once more toward the diamond display, the faintest hint of something unreadable crossed her expression, leaving behind a quiet certainty that the moment unfolding was far from over. The silence that followed did not feel like the end of a conversation, but the beginning of something far more deliberate, as if an invisible line had just been drawn across the polished marble floor. Evelyn Carter remained standing by the display, her reflection faintly mirrored in the glass beneath the diamonds, her expression calm but distant, like someone who had already stepped several moves ahead in a game no one else realized was being played. Lucas Bennett turned slightly, signaling the interaction was over, his attention already shifting toward a well-dressed couple entering the showroom. their tailored clothing and confident stride immediately capturing the kind of welcome he reserved for clients he deemed worthy. His smile returned, warmer now, genuine in a way it had never been for Evelyn. "Welcome to Bennett and Company," he said smoothly, stepping away without another glance in her direction. The transition was seamless, practiced, almost effortless, and yet it left behind a subtle tension that lingered in the air. Evelyn watched this shift without expression, her eyes following Lucas for just a moment before drifting back to the necklace. The room carried on, but not quite as it had before. A quiet awareness had settled over the space, subtle but undeniable. The associate who had whispered earlier now avoided looking in her direction entirely, while another employee pretended to reorganize a display that had already been perfectly arranged. It was the kind of silence that came not from peace, but from anticipation, as though something unresolved was waiting just beneath the surface. Evelyn reached into her bag slowly, her movements unhurried, deliberate. From within, she retrieved her phone, the screen lighting up softly in her hand. She glanced at it for a brief second, then dialed a number with quiet precision. The call connected almost immediately. "Hello," she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying just enough clarity to travel across the stillness of the showroom. She did not raise her voice, yet every word seemed to settle into the space around her. "Yes, I am at the store." A pause. Her eyes lifted slightly, sweeping across the displays, the staff, the customers, as if taking a final measure of the room. "I will need the documents brought over." Another pause, shorter this time. "No, there is no rush," she added, though something in her tone suggested the opposite. 10 minutes will be fine." She ended the call as quietly as she had begun it, slipping the phone back into her bag with the same calm precision. There was no announcement, no declaration, no visible reaction, and yet the atmosphere shifted again, almost imperceptibly. One of the associates glanced toward her, then quickly looked away, as if unsure whether what they had just heard carried any significance. Across the showroom, Lucas continued speaking with the new clients, laughing lightly at something they said, his attention fully engaged, his posture confident, unaware that the quiet moment behind him had already begun to reshape the room in ways he could not yet see. Evelyn stepped slightly to the side, giving herself a clearer view of the entire space. Her posture remained relaxed, her hands resting lightly at her sides, but her presence felt different now, less like a visitor and more like someone who belonged in the center of it all. The diamonds continued to shimmer under the focused lights, casting fragments of brilliance across the glass, across the marble, across her steady gaze. Time seemed to slow, not in any dramatic sense, but in the subtle way it does when something inevitable is approaching. The door at the entrance remained still for a moment longer, the outside world separated by glass and silence, until finally, it opened again. This time, the sound carried differently. It was not just the soft slide of glass, but the distinct rhythm of purposeful footsteps entering the showroom, measured, confident, impossible to ignore. A man in a tailored suit stepped inside, followed closely by a woman carrying a structured leather portfolio. Their presence did not announce itself loudly, but it commanded attention all the same. The security guard near the entrance straightened instinctively. One of the associates paused mid-step, watching them with quiet uncertainty. Evelyn did not turn immediately. She did not need to. Instead, she allowed a single second to pass, then another, before slowly shifting her gaze toward the entrance. Her eyes met theirs, and in that brief, silent exchange, something was confirmed without a single word being spoken. The balance of the room shifted once more, subtle but undeniable, like the moment just before a storm reveals itself. And somewhere behind the polished counters and confident smiles, the first crack in Lucas Bennett's certainty had already begun to form, though he remained completely unaware that everything he thought he understood about this moment was about to change. The moment the man in the tailored suit stepped fully into the showroom, the atmosphere shifted in a way that could not be ignored, not by the staff, not by the customers, and certainly not by Evelyn Carter, who now turned to face him with the same quiet composure she had carried since the moment she arrived. The woman beside him adjusted the leather portfolio in her hands, her posture precise, her expression focused, as if every second in this room had already been accounted for. Their footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor, deliberate and measured, drawing subtle glances from every corner of the showroom. One of the associates straightened immediately, smoothing her uniform, her eyes flickering toward Lucas Bennett as if waiting for direction. But Lucas was still engaged with his preferred clients, his laughter just a fraction too loud, his attention carefully curated toward those he believed mattered. He had not yet noticed the shift unfolding behind him. The suited man approached Evelyn directly, stopping at a respectful distance, his expression calm but attentive. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice low but clear, carrying just enough weight to ripple through the quiet room. The use of her name did not go unnoticed. Heads turned. Conversations softened. The subtle hierarchy of the space began to rearrange itself in real time. Evelyn inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, her expression unchanged, as if this interaction was nothing more than a routine continuation of her day. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she replied, her tone steady, almost casual, yet every word seemed to land with quiet authority. The woman with the portfolio stepped forward, opening it with practiced precision, revealing a set of neatly organized documents, each page aligned, each detail prepared. The faint rustle of paper cut through the silence like a signal. Across the showroom, Lucas's voice faltered for just a fraction of a second. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was enough. His eyes shifted, drawn by the tone, by the name, by something he could not yet fully place. He turned slightly, his gaze landing on Evelyn, then on the man standing before her, then on the documents being presented. The smile on his face held for a moment longer, as if refusing to yield to uncertainty, before it slowly tightened. The couple he had been assisting followed his gaze, their interest now redirected entirely. The room was no longer divided between customers and staff. It had become a single shared moment of quiet observation. Evelyn accepted the documents, her fingers moving with calm familiarity as she glanced through the pages. There was no hesitation, no confusion, only recognition. "Everything is in order," she said softly, closing the folder with a gentle, decisive motion. The man nodded once, stepping slightly to the side, giving her space, but not withdrawing his attention. Lucas took a step forward now, drawn by a growing sense that something had slipped beyond his control. The polished confidence that had defined his every movement began to shift, replaced by a more cautious awareness. "Is there something I can assist with?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral, though the edge of uncertainty was impossible to fully conceal. Evelyn turned toward him, finally giving him her full attention. The room seemed to hold its breath. The diamonds behind her shimmered under the lights, casting fractured reflections across the glass and onto the marble floor, as if the space itself were watching. "Actually," she said, her voice calm, measured, "there is." She paused, just long enough for the weight of her words to settle. Lucas straightened, instinctively returning to his role, though it no longer fit as comfortably as it had moments before. "I would like to proceed," Evelyn continued, her gaze steady. "With that piece." She gestured once more toward the necklace he had refused to show her, the same one he had deemed beyond her reach. The request was identical to before, but the room heard it differently now. Lucas followed her gesture, his mind racing through the fragments of information he had just witnessed, trying to reconcile the woman he had dismissed with the quiet authority now standing before him. The silence stretched, thick and unyielding. Somewhere near the entrance, the security guard shifted his stance, the faint sound echoing softly, the only movement in a room that had gone completely still. Lucas opened his mouth, then stopped, the practiced words he had used earlier no longer forming as easily. The certainty that had guided him was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar. Doubt. Evelyn did not move. She did not repeat herself. She simply waited, her eyes steady, her presence unwavering. And in that moment, the balance of power that had once seemed so clear had quietly, completely reversed, leaving Lucas Bennett standing in the very silence he had created, now forced to face what he had failed to see. Lucas Bennett felt the weight of every eye in the room settle on him, pressing against the carefully constructed confidence he had worn for years like a perfectly tailored suit. For a brief moment, he said nothing, his mind racing to recalibrate, to understand how a situation he had dismissed so easily had shifted beyond his control. The necklace Evelyn Carter had pointed to seemed different now, no longer just a luxury item behind glass, but a silent witness to his earlier judgment. He cleared his throat softly, stepping forward with measured caution, his tone adjusted, polished once again, but no longer effortless. "Of course," he said, forcing a small, controlled smile. "I would be happy to assist you with that piece." The words came out smoother than he felt, but there was a subtle tension beneath them, like a note slightly out of tune. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She watched him for a second longer, her gaze steady, unreadable, as if weighing not just his words, but everything that had come before them. Then, with a slight nod, she turned her attention back to the display. The associate closest to the case hesitated, glancing at Lucas for confirmation. He gave a quick, almost imperceptible signal, and she moved forward, unlocking the glass with careful precision. The faint click echoed louder than it should have in the quiet room. As the case opened, the light caught the necklace in full brilliance, each diamond reflecting sharp, clean flashes across the marble floor. The associate lifted it gently, placing it on a velvet tray, her hand steady but her movements slower than usual, aware of the attention surrounding her. She presented it toward Evelyn with a respectful tilt. Evelyn stepped closer, her eyes scanning the piece with calm familiarity. She did not react with surprise or awe. Instead, she studied it, as if confirming something she already knew. Lucas watched her closely, searching for any sign that might restore his earlier assumptions, but there was none. No hesitation, no uncertainty, only quiet certainty. "It is well crafted," Evelyn said softly, almost to herself. "The symmetry is precise." The associate blinked slightly, surprised by the observation, while Lucas felt a faint tightening in his chest. This was not the reaction of someone seeing such a piece for the first time. This was recognition, understanding. Evelyn reached out, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the necklace, not touching the diamonds directly, but close enough to feel their presence. Then she straightened, her decision already made. "I will take it," she said. The words were simple, delivered without emphasis, yet they landed with unmistakable finality. The room went completely still. One of the customers near the entrance shifted slightly, the faint sound of movement echoing in the silence. Lucas blinked once, processing the statement, his mind automatically moving to the next step, the process he had followed countless times before. "Certainly," he replied, though his voice carried a subtle hesitation he could not fully hide. "I will have that prepared for purchase." Evelyn turned her gaze to him again, and this time there was the faintest trace of something in her expression, not quite a smile, but something close. "No," she said gently. "There is no need to prepare anything." Lucas paused, confusion flickering across his face. The associate holding the tray remained frozen, unsure whether to move or wait. The man in the tailored suit beside Evelyn stepped forward slightly, his presence calm but authoritative, and the woman with the portfolio opened it once more. "The payment has already been arranged," the man said evenly. He reached into the portfolio and retrieved a document, extending it toward Lucas. "Full transfer authorization. Immediate execution." Lucas stared at the paper for a moment, his mind struggling to keep pace with what was unfolding. He accepted it slowly, his fingers tightening just slightly as he glanced over the figures. The number was unmistakable. It was not just the price of the necklace. It was more, significantly more. His eyes lifted back to Evelyn, the first real crack in his composure now fully visible. "This covers the piece," he said carefully, his voice quieter than before. "An additional inventory," the man added calmly. As instructed, the words settled into the room like a quiet shockwave. Evelyn remained still, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, as if this moment had always been inevitable. Lucas felt the ground beneath his certainty shift completely, the realization forming slowly but undeniably. This was never about a single purchase. It never had been. The necklace, the refusal, the silence, every moment had led here. And now, standing in the reflection of the very diamonds he had denied her, he understood that the measure he had used to judge her had not just been wrong. It had been irrelevant. Lucas Bennett stood frozen for a fraction too long, the document still in his hand, the numbers on the page refusing to settle into something ordinary. He had spent years around wealth, around transactions that most people could not even imagine, and yet this felt different. It was not just the size of the transfer. It was the calm certainty with which it had been executed, as if the amount itself held no weight at all. His eyes moved from the document back to Evelyn Carter, and for the first time, he truly looked at her, not at her clothes, not at her quiet demeanor, but at the presence she carried so effortlessly. The showroom remained silent, the kind of silence that did not come from emptiness, but from attention, from the collective awareness that something significant had just unfolded. The associate still held the velvet tray, her arms steady but her posture tense, unsure whether to proceed or wait for instruction. The couple Lucas had been assisting earlier now stood completely still, their interest no longer in the jewelry, but in the shift they had just witnessed. Lucas cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation, but his voice, when it came, was softer than before. "I will finalize the transaction immediately," he said, though the words sounded more like a formality than a necessity. The man in the tailored suit gave a small nod, as if acknowledging a step that had already been completed long before this moment. "Everything has been authorized," he replied calmly. "You will receive confirmation within seconds." As if on cue, a soft chime echoed from the system behind the counter. One of the associates glanced at the screen, her eyes widening slightly as she read the notification. She looked toward Lucas, then back at the screen, as if needing to confirm what she was seeing was real. "It has cleared," she said quietly, though her voice carried through the stillness. The words settled over the room like a final confirmation. There was no more uncertainty, no more hesitation. The transaction was complete. Lucas lowered the document slowly, the weight of the moment pressing against him in a way he could not ignore. He forced a small smile, attempting to rebuild the professional composure that had once defined him, but it no longer fit as it had before. "Miss Carter," he began, his tone carefully respectful now, stripped of its earlier edge, "please accept my apologies if there was any misunderstanding earlier. We strive to provide the highest level of service to all our clients." The sentence was polished, practiced, the kind of apology that had likely worked countless times before. But as it left his mouth, it felt different, thinner, lacking the authority it once carried. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, her gaze steady. When he finished, she allowed a brief silence to pass, just long enough for his words to settle into the space between them. Then she spoke, her voice calm, measured, and impossibly clear. "There was no misunderstanding," she said. The simplicity of the statement cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice could have. Lucas felt it immediately, the quiet correction, the subtle refusal to soften what had already been done. Evelyn took a small step forward, closing the distance just slightly, not in confrontation, but in clarity. "You made a decision based on what you saw," she continued, her tone neither harsh nor forgiving, simply factual. "And now you are adjusting based on what you know." The room went completely still. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the faint hum of the lighting seemed to fade into the background. Lucas opened his mouth, then closed it again, the words he might have used dissolving before they could form. For the first time, he had no response that could restore what had been lost. Evelyn turned her attention briefly to the necklace, still resting on the velvet tray, its brilliance unchanged, its value now carrying a different meaning entirely. "Please have it delivered," she added, her voice returning to its earlier calm. "I trust your team can handle that." The associate nodded quickly, almost instinctively, her earlier hesitation replaced by urgency. "Of course, Miss Carter," she said, her tone respectful, careful. Evelyn gave a small nod, then stepped back, her posture relaxed once more, as if the moment had already passed for her. The man and woman beside her gathered the documents with quiet efficiency, their movements smooth, practiced, unobtrusive. Lucas remained where he was, the document still in his hand, though it no longer mattered. The polished confidence he had relied on for so long had been replaced by something else entirely, something quieter, heavier, and far more difficult to ignore. Around him, the showroom slowly began to breathe again, the tension easing, the silence breaking into soft, cautious movement. But the shift that had taken place did not fade with the moment. It remained, subtle but permanent, etched into the memory of everyone who had witnessed it. And as Evelyn Carter turned toward the exit, her steps as quiet as when she had entered, the marble floors echoed not with judgment, but with a quiet reminder of something far more enduring than wealth. Respect, once withheld, could not be reclaimed so easily. The glass doors opened again with a soft whisper as Evelyn Carter approached them, the late afternoon light stretching across the marble floor like a quiet path leading outward, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the entire showroom held its breath, unwilling to let the moment fully pass. She did not rush. She did not look back immediately. Her steps remained measured, calm, the same quiet rhythm she had carried from the very beginning, as if nothing extraordinary had just taken place. Behind her, the atmosphere lingered in a fragile balance, the kind that follows a moment people know they will remember long after it is over. Lucas Bennett remained standing near the counter, his posture still, his gaze fixed on the space she had just occupied. The document in his hand felt heavier now, not because of the numbers it contained, but because of what it represented. Around him, the staff moved cautiously, their voices lowered, their gestures more deliberate, as if the entire environment had subtly shifted into something more aware, more careful. The associate who had presented the necklace finally lowered the velvet tray, her hands steady again, though her expression carried a quiet reflection she had not held before. The couple, who had been browsing earlier, exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, before returning their attention to the displays, though their interest no longer held the same lightness it once had. Near the entrance, the security guard straightened again, not out of routine this time, but out of recognition, as Evelyn approached with the same quiet presence that had transformed the room. Just before she reached the door, she paused. It was not a dramatic pause, not one meant to draw attention, but it carried a weight all its own. Slowly, she turned her head, her gaze moving back across the showroom one final time. Her eyes did not search for Lucas specifically, and yet, somehow, they found him. For a brief second, their eyes met across the polished space, across the glass, the light, the distance that had once defined their interaction. There was no anger in her expression, no triumph, no need to claim the moment. There was only clarity, calm and unwavering. Lucas felt it immediately, the quiet acknowledgement, the unspoken understanding of everything that had just occurred. He straightened instinctively, as if trying to reclaim something that had already slipped beyond his reach. "Miss Carter," he called out, his voice measured but carrying just enough urgency to cross the room. The word hung in the air, drawing subtle attention once more. Evelyn paused, her hand resting lightly on the door handle, but she did not turn fully back. "If there is anything further we can do," Lucas continued, choosing his words carefully now, "we would be honored to assist you." It was a different tone, stripped of assumption, shaped by realization. Evelyn considered the words for a brief moment, then gave the slightest nod, not as acceptance, but as acknowledgement. "I am sure you will," she replied softly. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried a quiet meaning that extended beyond the surface. Then, without another word, she opened the door and stepped outside. The light shifted as she left, the reflections inside the showroom settling back into their usual patterns, though something about them felt different now, less absolute, less certain. The door closed behind her with a soft, final sound, and for a moment, no one moved. The silence that followed was not the same as before. It was not anticipation, not tension, but reflection. Lucas remained where he was, his gaze lingering on the door long after it had closed. The confidence he had once worn so easily now felt distant, replaced by something quieter, something that did not demand attention but refused to be ignored. Around him, the showroom slowly returned to motion, conversations resuming, footsteps echoing once more across the marble floor, but the shift remained, subtle yet permanent. And somewhere beyond the glass doors, beyond the polished displays and curated impressions, Evelyn Carter walked away exactly as she had entered, simple, quiet, and entirely unchanged, leaving behind a room that would never quite see the same way again. The showroom did not return to normal, not entirely, not in the way it had been before she walked in, because something invisible had shifted beneath the polished surface, something that could not be rearranged like a display or reset with a practiced smile. Minutes passed, though they felt longer, stretched by the quiet weight left behind. The staff moved, but slower, more aware, as if each gesture now carried meaning. Lucas Bennett finally exhaled, a breath he had not realized he had been holding, and turned back toward the counter, placing the document down with a care that bordered on hesitation. The numbers on the page no longer demanded attention. It was the realization behind them that lingered. One of the associates approached him cautiously, her voice lowered. "Should we update the inventory records now?" she asked, her tone careful, almost tentative. Lucas nodded, though his focus seemed distant, his thoughts still anchored to the moment that had just unfolded. "Yes," he replied quietly. "Make sure everything is processed correctly." The associate nodded quickly and stepped away, her movements precise, as if determined not to make any mistake in the wake of what they had witnessed. Across the showroom, the couple who had arrived earlier resumed their browsing, though their demeanor had changed. The ease they carried before had been replaced by something more observant, more reflective, as if they, too, had been reminded of something beyond the surface of luxury. Near the entrance, the security guard shifted his stance again, his gaze lingering briefly on the door before returning to his post, though his posture now held a subtle alertness that had not been there before. Time moved forward, but it did not erase what had happened. Instead, it settled into the space, quiet and undeniable. Lucas reached for a cloth on the counter, picking it up out of habit, then paused, his hand still. For years, he had relied on instinct, on quick judgments shaped by appearance, by patterns that had rarely failed him. But now, standing in the reflection of glass and light, those instincts felt incomplete, as if they had revealed only part of the truth. He set the cloth down slowly, his gaze drifting toward the display where the necklace had been. The empty space behind the glass felt more noticeable than the piece itself ever had. One of the younger associates approached that same display, her movements careful as she adjusted the lighting, though there was nothing left to illuminate. She paused for a second, her reflection merging with the glass, then stepped back, her expression thoughtful. "I did not expect that," she murmured softly, not to anyone in particular, but the words carried. Another associate nearby gave a small nod. "Neither did I," he replied, his voice equally quiet. "But maybe we should have." The conversation faded as quickly as it had begun, leaving behind a shared understanding that did not need to be spoken further. Lucas heard it, every word, though no one had directed it toward him. He straightened slightly, his posture shifting, not in defense, but in recognition. The certainty he once carried had been replaced by something else, something quieter but far more enduring. Awareness. The door remained closed, the outside world moving as it always had, but inside, the reflection of that moment continued to ripple outward, touching each person in ways that were not immediately visible, but deeply felt. Lucas glanced once more toward the entrance, his gaze lingering, just a fraction longer this time, as if expecting something, or perhaps understanding that nothing more needed to happen. The lesson had already arrived. Around him, the showroom slowly settled into its rhythm again, the soft echo of footsteps returning, the low murmur of voices rising gently. But beneath it all, the silence remained, not empty, but full, carrying with it a quiet reminder that would not fade with time. And in that stillness, among the glass cases and polished floors, something far more valuable than any diamond had been revealed, not displayed under lights, not measured by price, but understood in a way that could not be undone. Respect, once overlooked, had a way of returning, not with noise, but with undeniable clarity. The evening light outside had begun to soften into a warm glow, stretching across the city streets as Evelyn Carter walked away from the showroom, her pace steady, her presence unchanged, as if the weight of what had just occurred had never belonged to her in the first place. Inside Bennett and Company, however, the moment continued to linger, not as a disturbance, but as something far more lasting, something that had quietly rewritten the way the room understood itself. Lucas Bennett stood alone near the central counter, the usual rhythm of the showroom moving around him, yet somehow not touching him the same way it once had. He watched as a new customer entered, a man in casual attire, nothing particularly remarkable at first glance, and for a brief second, Lucas felt the familiar instinct rise within him, that automatic assessment he had relied on for years. But this time, something stopped him. It was not hesitation born from fear, nor uncertainty from lack of experience. It was awareness, clear and deliberate. He stepped forward anyway, but differently now, his posture open, his tone neutral, stripped of the quiet assumptions that had once guided him so easily. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm, steady, offering the same level of attention without measure. The man nodded, slightly surprised by the immediate welcome, and began to speak about what he was looking for, his words simple, direct. Lucas listened, truly. Listened, not searching for signals of status or wealth, but for understanding. And in that moment, something shifted again, quieter this time, but just as real. Across the showroom, the associates worked with a new sense of awareness, their movements no longer driven solely by habit, but by intention. One of them assisted a woman near the entrance, offering her a selection of pieces with the same care that would have been reserved only for their highest clients before. The woman smiled, her expression brightening, unaware of the change that had made the moment possible. Near the display where the necklace had once been, the empty space remained, not as a loss, but as a reminder. The lighting still illuminated the glass, casting reflections across the marble floor, but now those reflections carried a different meaning, one not tied to price or prestige, but to something far more enduring. Time passed, as it always does, but the lesson did not fade with it. It settled into the foundation of the space, shaping each interaction in ways that could not be undone. Lucas found himself glancing toward the door once more, not expecting Evelyn Carter to return, but acknowledging the impact she had left behind. He did not need to see her again to understand what had changed. The realization was already complete. As the evening continued, the showroom regained its rhythm, conversations rising and falling, footsteps echoing softly across the polished floor, but beneath it all, there remained a quiet clarity, a shared understanding that had not existed before. And somewhere beyond the glass doors, beyond the curated displays and measured impressions, Evelyn moved through the world exactly as she had always done, without the need to prove anything, without the need to be seen in any particular way. Because what she carried was never dependent on appearance, never defined by the judgments of others. And inside Bennett and Company, among the diamonds and the light, the truth she left behind continued to echo, not in words, but in the way people chose to see, to listen, and to treat one another. And that evening, without announcement, without spectacle, the room learned something. It would not forget. Respect is not something that should wait for proof. It is something that should exist before it.